Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Keith and Boris, a Verbatim Theater journey. On the 15th of March 2022, I was allocated my groups for my 2 end-of-year projects. The first show was The Rule of Six, directed by Anna Robinson, and was to be performed on July 1st, 2022. The second show was Keith, directed by Soren Wellens, and was to be performed on July 7th, 2022. Keith is a solo performance with the entire dialogue in the show taken from the journals I wrote between 1977 and 1989.
The Rule of Six is a poem written by Gavin Hadfield and converted into a stage play by Anna Robinson. The characters in the show consisted of myself, Boris, ex-Prime Minister, Nadine Dorris, Donald Trump, multiple news reporters, and Gavin playing himself.
Getting cast. When choosing what production I wanted to be cast in, my main choice was Keith. This was because I'd never done a solo performance before. I also had no experience portraying a real-life person, so I thought it would take my acting skills to a new level if I went and put the work in. Keith was also a dramatic piece, which as an actor I sometimes struggle with. This was because comedic performances always came more naturally to me. And I think when you get that laugh from the audience throughout your performance, it gives you a sense of validation. However, when I joined this MA acting course, I promised myself that I'd push myself out of my comfort zone, and that is why doing a dramatic performance was important to me. To prove to myself and my peers that I am not a one-dimensional actor and that I have little desire to be typecast. I am happy to play a multitude of different characters. It doesn't always have to be the lead, and it doesn't always have to be the comedic character. First rehearsal. So in my first rehearsal for Keith, Studio 2 was free. So I managed to get a feel for the space that I would be performing in 4 months later. We started the rehearsal with a quick warm-up and then spent the first half of rehearsals cutting down the first year of Keith's journals, 1977. We managed to cut 1977 down to 2 A4 pages from the original 10. And we eventually kept this 1977 script the same way all the way up until the final performance, without adding or cutting anything else from that year. In the second half of the rehearsal, we took the script that we cut and got it on its feet. I improvised throughout the dialogue, and Soren gave me advice after every single run.
For Ryan's first rehearsal of The Rule of Six, Anna briefly talked to the cast through the premise for the performance and her desire to use physical theatre within the piece. Then she got the cast members to participate in 3 run-throughs of Poem 1, playing different characters each time, obviously. The characters were me, Boris, Nadine Dorries, and a newsreader. After the 3rd run-through, they were assigned their characters, and therefore Ryan was cast as me, Boris.
Similarities and differences. So the main difference between Keith and The Rule of Six is the genres. Keith is a naturalistic drama, whilst The Rule of Six uses satire and slapstick comedy. Furthermore, another large difference between the two is that Keith is also a prose text.
Prose is a conversational way of speaking, which doesn't have a set rhythm or structure.
And The Rule of Six is verse, as it was a poem transitioned into a stage play while still retaining the structure of the poem.
Verse is defined by a rhythm and can rhyme, although it often doesn't.
The Rule of Six is also an ensemble piece which relies on every single member to get their lines exactly correct in order for the poem to work. The major similarities between both these productions is that they are both very different examples of verbatim theatre. Verbatim theatre has been the term utilised by Derek Paget during his extensive researches into the form of documentary drama, which employs largely or exclusively tape-recorded material from the real-life originals of the characters and events to which it gives dramatic shape. When thinking about verbatim theatre, Aleki Blythe, who is a verbatim practitioner, states that you should tell the person or people that you are recording them for an interview and always let them know exactly what you are up to. The latter is specifically important if Ryan and Soren would like to take the production of Keith to festivals or a professional stage outside of education. This is because the Keith Haring Foundation owns the entire Keith Haring journals. Therefore, Ryan and Sauron would need the Foundation's permission to use extracts of the journals for monetary gain in a professional setting. Inspiration from other companies and projects. One production I really took inspiration from was My Name is Rachel Corrie, another autobiographical theatre piece which debuted in 2005 based on the journals of real-life person Rachel Corrie, an American activist who was crushed to death by an Israeli soldier in an armoured bulldozer at the Gaza Strip in Palestine. Her journals were developed into a one-woman play by journalist Catherine Viner and actor Alan Rickman, who also directed the piece. Throughout the performance, the actress playing Rachel also carries around and often speaks from her journal, similar to the way Keith Haring does in our show Keith. University of East London Masters Directing student Reagan Kiefer also put on a Verbatim Theater production for her end-of-year performance. Her performance told the story of how her grandfather discovered he was adopted, and after he passes away, Reagan, portrayed by actress Alara in the performance, attempts to find her long-lost family members. She used real interviews played as an audio recording at certain points throughout the performance, but also had actors portraying those family members too. In our performance of Keith, we also used audio and digital recording. Most of the audio recording is of myself saying the lines, but at one point during the montage, Keith's real voice is heard for a couple of seconds. We thought this would be powerful to let the audience that didn't know who he was know what he looked and sounded like in direct comparison to myself. A company that I specifically researched was Lung Theatre Company, to compare and contrast the style of verbatim theatre that they put on. Lung creates productions that shine a spotlight on current social, political and economic issues within the United Kingdom. They do this by using people's real words to devise and tell their stories in a theatrical environment. They create political theatre and run campaigns alongside their performances. They recently created a performance called E15. The Paper Birds Theatre Company are also a company that I researched, as they claim to be one of the UK's leading verbatim theatre companies. They were created in 2003 and over the past 20 years consistently describe themselves as a devising company with a social and political agenda. And when gaining a deeper knowledge of the company, a production that caught my eye was Broke. The premise of the production is based on displaced families, gambling addictions and real-life stories from the front line of poverty and debt in the UK. Yorkshire Post had this to say on the project. Using their trademarks of physical and verbatim theatre, the Paper Birds have created a piece of work about debt that is honest and searingly painful. By concentrating on intensely personal stories, including their own, they have found the universal. Both Broke and E15 are great examples of how verbatim theatre and political theatre can work hand in hand and complement each other to get the point of the story across to the audience. I compared these two productions to my performance in The Rule of Six, because although The Rule of Six is a satirical comedy, it also has a political agenda, which is very much against the Tories and exposing them. Why does biographical theatre interest Ryan? So biographical theatre interests me because as an actor, your job is to tell someone's story from a first person point of view. Whether the person I'm portraying is a positive or negative historical figure, I must portray that person truthfully, and even if you personally do not agree with their morals or beliefs, for the sake of the story, I must play the character's truth in a believable way. Within the dialogue of the script, there are sometimes sides of this historical figure that you were unaware existed, and therefore as a performer it leaves the opening for interpretation. Canton 2007 observes that the feeling of obligation to refer back to information about a historical figure portrayed in biographical theatre on the one hand, and the need to create an interpretation of a role that works on an artistic level on the other, thus create a field of tension in which individual actors have to situate their own work. When I was portraying Keith Haring, I was developing my own interpretation of him, while still attempting to be as close and true to the real version as possible. However, when performing as Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, I was given the artistic license by Anna to create my own pompous, satirical, power-hungry version of them, and therefore the voice, physicality and movements were all exaggerated. So Canton 2007, page 117, backs this idea of biographical theatre up by stating, most often, the choice of accent, tone, and diction is left to the actor and the director. Which project does Ryan prefer? So my opinion of these projects actually changed throughout the rehearsal process. When I was cast, I was 100% more excited for Keith, because I knew this sort of show would push my acting skill to new limits. From the very first rehearsal and the beginning of the research and development process, I found that I was enjoying playing the Rule of Six characters, Boris and Donald, much more than I expected. The reason for this was mainly because I was able to develop my own comedic slapstick version of these characters, which was very fun for me. Furthermore, having both dyslexia and ADHD, I find it very hard to read scripts for the first time. However, when doing the cold read for the Rule of Six, to discover what characters we are each going to play, I didn't struggle at all, as I was able to play up to the slapstick nature of the characters and put on a different voice immediately, which took my mind off reading the words on the script. And then from early June 2022, my preference changed again in the direction of Keith. I began developing a close personal connection to the story he is telling in the journals, specifically in the first scene in 1977 when he is constantly telling the story about how he doubts himself. Every rehearsal from then on I thoroughly enjoyed and loved discovering new elements to my own version of Keith Haring. Challenges of each production. So Keith presented a lot of initial challenges. His unique style of drawing and artwork is what initially springs to mind. Although the drawings don't look difficult, they really do require a lot of time and practice if you want to replicate them perfectly. When learning how to draw the Radiant Baby, Soren told me that I should try and see numbers and shapes to make up the images. We discovered that the Radiant Baby is made up of a long number 2 going along the back and down to the foot, and then it goes straight into a number 3, as you can see here. So Keith's voice and accent were also a struggle to get right. This is because Keith has a strident lisp, which is when too much air is being forced through a narrow opening. Therefore, it sounds like a whistle. Later on, I will talk about how a certain Meisner technique helped me with Keith's voice. Another challenge was Keith's movement and replicating his style of painting. So he paints fast and is always on his feet, never on his knees, which is what I personally would do if I was to draw on the floor. And then also remembering that there is supposed to be artwork and wet paint on the floor, and therefore not walking over it when performing a scene.
For the Rule of Six, what Ryan struggled with the most was the Prelude, which was a synchronized physical theatre piece inspired by DV8. Ryan struggled with this due to his costume. Throughout the sequence, the movements kept getting faster, and Ryan, being in a tight suit with tight trousers, was sometimes unable to replicate the girls' movements at speed, as they were wearing looser fitted clothing. Haha.
Cutting down the script. So Soren would cut down the script 1 year at a time, going in chronological order. Then he would bring the script to Ryan. It was Ryan's job to cut down whatever Soren brought to him into either 1 or 1.5 A4 pages. Sometimes there were as many as 15 A4 pages that needed to be cut down. Soren and Ryan knew they only had 45 minutes for the performance. So unfortunately, using the entire 367-page journal was not an option. However, one thing they did not initially take into account was how long the paintings would take to create, which evidently elongated the production without any actual dialogue. Adapting Ben Archer's push and pull technique, Ryan came up with the initial idea of using an adapted version of the push and pull technique created by Ben Archer. In Ben's version, the actors stand around a hula hoop and the director says the character's lines. The actor then repeats the line and chooses to either push the hoop towards another actor or pull the hoop towards themselves. The adapted technique included Soren feeding the lines and Ryan repeating whilst mainly focusing on his drawing/painting in the scene. This proved to be helpful when learning how to draw Haring's artwork because Ryan did not need to take any of his attention away from the art throughout the scene. However, they discovered after many sessions of using this technique that it was not helping Ryan learn the lines because the scene was constantly being paused after each line in order to receive the next line. Therefore, Ryan was unable to make a mental connection to the script, and so could not visualize what part of the scene he was at, what comes next, and what the stage directions were. Experimentation for Keith. So much of Keith was subject to experimentation, and a prime example of this was the giant floor painting. We had originally planned to have the See No Evil, Hear No Evil, and Speak No Evil artwork on the floor as the centerpiece. After an hour of practicing and learning to draw the piece, me and Soren decided that the piece didn't really have any true meaning to the story. Furthermore, I threw in the idea of using Buddies, a painting he drew in 1989, and the final painting he ever made before he passed away. I thought using this painting would wrap up the performance perfectly and leave the audience with a sense of completion to Keith's story. workshops that enhanced the performance. Okay, so now let's talk about using Meisner's imitation technique. Interviews of Keith Haring from 1983 were used in order to rehearse and practice Sanford Meisner's imitation technique, which I learned from Robin Patterson on the 24th of February 2022 during week 4 of term 2. To rehearse this technique, I would sit in front of the screen as Soren played extracts from the interview, and I repeated these lines in the exact same way Keith did. And here is an example of me doing this.
They went above ground and bought some chalk and went back down.
Immediately went above ground and bought some chalk and went back down. I also used this technique for the rule of 6 as I was playing 3 real-life people throughout the 2 productions. And I thought the imitation technique would enable me to pick up little nuances from both Boris and Donald as well. There was also some inspiration taken from Spitting Image's interpretation of Boris Johnson. So when working on my version of Boris Johnson, Meisner's imitation technique worked hand in hand with clowning.
What clowning taught Ryan throughout his research is to go with his first instincts, and if things don't always work out perfectly, then that is fine. Ryan then did some more intense research on clowning and also watched Alex Bell's TED Talk. Ryan then also did a couple of workshops with Alex Bell as part of East London Theatre School. There are 3 rules to clowning. Number 1 is no talking, which Ryan obviously had to abandon that rule for the sake of the performance. 2, to love the audience. Rule 3, be in yes mode and stay in yes mode. Also some additional information that Alex Bell has taught Ryan along his clowning journey is to make bold choices, and the use of pace is also key. Slow motion or fast forward.
Reflections on rehearsals. It was obvious from early on in the process that Keith Haring did not stay in one place for very long, and throughout his journals he mentions travelling to many places across the world. Therefore, we needed to have a stage that did not take shape of one singular space or place. However, the structure of the stage never changes its shape during the performance, but the audience are made aware of where Keith is by a mixture of his dialogue in the moment and sometimes the projection in the background. An example of this is when Keith says, "I'm in Kutztown, missing that wonderful New York City air." This piece of dialogue lets the audience know that Keith has gone back to his home in Kutztown and is currently no longer in New York. I also used Kolb's reflective cycle after every rehearsal to document my discoveries. Kolb's reflective cycle is made up of 4 key areas. To give an example of how I used this for Keith, first I needed to have, number 1, concrete experience, which is trying to draw the Radiant Baby and other artworks of Keith. Moving on to number 2, which is reflective observation, reviewing it against the original and reflecting on what is right and what needs to be worked on. Into number 3, abstract conceptualization, learning how to break this down into individual shapes. This will lead into number 4, active experimentation, planning on how to do the next attempt and trying out what I have learned and then going through those cycles again and again. After happily sitting through Robin Nelson's 1 hour and 15-minute presentation on practice as research with a huge smile on my face the entire time, a quote he said really stuck out to me. He said, "I emphasize the term practice as research because I want to stress that the practice is the research." After his presentation, I read Robin Nelson's Practice as Research book to develop my knowledge further on his triangular method, which I was eager to try because I had only used Kolb's reflective cycle up until that point, and therefore I thought I would compare and contrast. So Robin Nelson's triangular method is made up of 3 key areas. The know-how, which is the embodied forms of knowledge, the know-what, which is made explicit through critical reflection, and finally the know-that, which incorporates conceptual frameworks and outsider knowledge. Stage designs. Thorin had the idea of having a large painting in the center of the stage. They managed to get a large 2 meter by 4 meter canvas for Ryan to paint on during the performance. Because Ryan and Soren did not have a fixed script due to the journals needing to be cut down, the ideas for staging changed during the rehearsal process. Therefore, they eventually decided to have some parts of the set serve the purpose of the illustration, such as using the table as a bridge for Keith to sign. Ryan decided that creating a backstage area behind the table using one of the large mirrors covered in black cloth would really enhance the performance. The reason for this is because it allows Ryan to go off stage and change his clothing as the character of Keith matures during the performance. And also it splits up the scenes nicely too. A good example of this is when Ryan as Keith talks about how devastated he was when he discovered that Andy Warhol died. And then the next piece of dialogue is Keith being really excited about seeing George Condo in Munich. Ryan believed that this transition would not be as strong or believable had there not been that small break in between for Keith to go off stage. They also used a table as a way to elevate Keith when he is sat down, as they knew that the audience would be lower down. They did this to ensure that there were no sightline issues. Feedback for Keith from tutors and peers. So Pavlos, one of the tutors for the module, mentioned making the artwork more aesthetically pleasing. The one he was specifically referring to was my initial idea of combining the radiant baby and the computer. He mentioned the picture looked very cluttered compared to the pyramid drawing on the other side of the stage. I took this idea on board and removed the radiant babies from the picture and drew them at a later point in the performance, which really worked because Keith directly references the radiant babies later on. Module leader Tom Drayton provided me with the feedback that I could try and stay in specific areas of the stage instead of aimlessly walking around all over the place. Especially if I am drawing a piece of art on stage left, there is no point walking to centre stage to say a piece of dialogue and then walking all the way back over to stage left to finish off the art. I should just say the dialogue in the vicinity of which I am drawing. And when the scene or art is finished, then I can move away. So on the 5th of April 2022, we did our first work in progress showings to the rest of the class and the tutors. So classmates and directing students, Sophia and Tamara, said the voice and characterization for Keith really worked. And they also mentioned how the music really complemented the piece. Directing student Kevin Murphy talked about the journey and edit the journals in a way to create the story arch. And tutors Tom and Pav said to think about the dates and transitions and how to make these work for the audience. Technical designs. So in Keith, there was some complexity to the set. We wanted to have a camera above the stage pointing down, providing a live stream, as you can see in this picture. So the audience can see a bird's eye view of the progress of the painting, which eventually turns into Keith's final ever drawing, Buddies, as I mentioned before. We also needed to have different spotlights pointing to different sections of the stage. This is for when Keith is doing a painting, the room goes dark except for that one section of the stage, to focus all of the audience's attention to that one specific area. We also needed the projector to be working. 1 for the aforementioned live stream, and 2 for the digital montage recordings that are shown throughout the performance. For the rule of 6, the projector also needed to be used, as in between each scene/poem, there was a different song and video playing. We also needed a live microphone on stage for Gavin's final speech at the end of the show. Script developments.
For the rule of 6, the script had already been developed from poem into stage play, and the script was not edited throughout the rehearsal process. The only part that was slightly developed was the prelude sequence. For initially it was only supposed to be one news reporter speaking. However, the group decided to split it between Ryan, Alara, and Kara, and they each recorded sections of the script. This was then played as an audio recording whilst they performed their physical theatre Deviate-inspired movement piece at the start of the performance.
So developing, or mainly cutting the script, took most of the early rehearsal time for Keith. The journals had to be cut down from 367 A5 pages to just 16 A4 pages. Here is a version of the script after being cut down, and there are some stage directions written alongside some of the paragraphs. The reason for this is that I'm required to do Keith's artwork in between certain sections of dialogue, and each specific mark must be memorised by myself. If not, some paintings or pictures could remain incomplete after the scene. An example of this is here on page 6. I'm required to complete the radiant pyramid drawing throughout the section of the dialogue, because after this section, Keith admires his work and then moves on from the topic of Egyptian art. Furthermore, as you can see on the next page, Keith must now sit next to an audience member and then go to the washing line to grab 2 photos, confirming the worry of having no time later on in the scene to complete the pyramid artwork. Keith mentions a love of poetry many times throughout the journals. There are multiple poems we decided to include in our performance. In fact, the first thing the audience members hear and see is a projection when they walk into the theatre. And at the midway point of the play, Keith also reads out a poem at the Club 57 poetry reading. We agreed to choose this poem specifically because it brings some much needed humour to the performance, which is needed because everything post this poem is related to AIDS, the death of his friends, and evidently the death of him. In our final script, we kept the very first entry from the journals in 1977 and the final entry from the journals in 1989. Although the final entry did not initially feel like a scene that a theatre performance would usually end on, I mentioned to Soren that we should keep it exactly like that. The reason for this is because Keith as a person is really ill and suffering from AIDS. He's reminiscing on a very positive time, and death always comes at unexpected times, and not everybody gets that perfect conclusion to their story. Therefore, this story did not need a perfect conclusion because oftentimes in our lives, we never usually get that.
That's all, folks.